Now let's move on to risk assessment. So what is involved in risk assessment? What are the different steps that are involved in risk assessment? So there are four basic steps that are involved in risk assessment. These four steps. Okay. So let's talk about the first one. So the very first step in risk assessment is identifying assets and their value. Okay. So in any organization, there are a lot of assets, right? That means they have a lot of things that are of value. However, just because they are important does not mean that they are all equally important, right? And you always have limited resources, limited budget, limited effort, limited time. So you want to use your effort, your time, your money very carefully, very judiciously. So the first step in risk assessment is to identify what assets do you have which are really critical, and then start from those assets and what is the value of those assets. Okay, so that you can do the risk assessment for those assets first and then go to less important assets later. So that is the first step, identifying assets and their value. Now once you have identified the assets where the risk assessment needs to be done, and you have identified their value as well, once you have done that, then the next step is in the risk assessment is to identify what are the vulnerabilities that are present in those assets, right? It could be an application, it could be a server, it could be a data center, or maybe a process or anything else. The next step in risk assessment is to identify what are the various vulnerabilities, what are the various weaknesses that could be exploited in those assets and then lead to the compromise of those assets. Okay, so you identify the vulnerabilities, and then once you have identified the vulnerabilities, you then identify what are the various threats. That means what are the various dangers that can take place because of these vulnerabilities getting exploited. Okay, so that is the second step. Now once you know the important assets, once you have identified the vulnerabilities and the threats to those assets, the next step is finding the actual risk, which is finding the probability of those vulnerabilities getting exploited and what will be the resulting business impact if that were to actually happen. So that is the third step. And then finally, once you have the value of risk calculated, then finally you see, all right, now we know that these are the assets which are really important. We know that these are the vulnerabilities present, and we know that this is the risk that is present for these assets because of these vulnerabilities and because of the probability and the business impact. This is the risk that we have. So now what do we do? Now we know that, for example, you could say that, hey, now that we know that if there is a server, a really critical server, and if that server were to get compromised because of a certain vulnerability, and if that server were to become unavailable for an hour, for example, it could lead to the loss of, let's say, $1 million for the business, right? Then next step, or the last step, is to decide what controls can you put in place, what countermeasures, what safeguards can you put in place so that the loss of $1 million per hour can be reduced to an acceptable level. This is where the cost benefit analysis comes into picture, where you see what is the cost of putting the controls so that you get the right amount of benefit for the cost of putting those controls, because the controls that you put in place to reduce the loss, to reduce the risk, should not be higher than the benefit itself, right? So these are the four big steps that are involved in the risk assessment steps. Okay,